I beg you, just make it quick." The words left Salana like a paper boat on a dark current, fragile and urgent and utterly human. They hung between the humming stone and the windless air of the cavern, and for a moment everything answered by stopping. The bioluminescent veins in the walls dimmed to a soft, held gray. The low, planetary hum that lived beneath Veera's surface thinned into a single, sustained note. Even the breath in her lungs seemed to pause at the edge of the syllables. She had not meant to say them aloud. They were a plea she had rehearsed in private, an echo of old fears. Yet they escaped because something hot and sharp and unbearable had made them necessary. The glow around Nirth flickered, then steadied as if listening. Salana had come to Veera to study lifeforms that refracted light rather than heat, to map immune systems that whispered rather than roared. She had measured wavelengths until dawn, catalogued petal structures and glandular nodes with a precision that satisfied committees and journals. On paper, she was a scientist, precise hypotheses, cautious terminology, a steady voice in the archive. In the caves, under the coral arches that pulsed like living constellations, she was something else, a person with hands that trembled when trust was offered. Jack had been in her peripheral vision from the moment they disembarked, a familiar stride, the tilt of his head when he catalogued mineral densities, the tired softness around the eyes that she remembered from a dozen other missions. They had not left Earth as a pair. The mission manifest had not reconciled their history. They had left with a history between them, shared coffee spoons, arguments that closed doors, with promises broken gently, like brittle glass. He had come because the funding board had asked for expertise, and because he had been stubborn in believing some part of them could be reclaimed. Veera took a different measure than human habit. Night and day were a single fold. The moons painted the canopy in shifting tapestries, and the flora released scents that tasted like memory. The team's instruments hummed in the docking bay and failed to capture what mattered. The way Nirth seemed to appear within a sound rather than a form, the tactile language of light that ran along its limbs like script. People called it a guardian because it shepherded the cavern's equilibrium, but Salana learned to think of it as an ambassador of a sensibility long unfamiliar to human minds. Their first meeting with Nirth had been quiet and ridiculous, scientific caution meeting a being for whom caution was a slow, living echo. Salana reached out, a reflexive human gesture, and the alien answered not with words but with warmth moving through the veins in the rock that touched her palm. It was like slipping one finger into a river and having the river rearrange itself to welcome the light.
Nirth extended a tendril of flora, a small blossom that throbbed faintly with its own inner music. Salana accepted it and felt something honest pass between them, a pact of mutual curiosity. That exchange was the hinge upon which their days turned. Salana spent mornings mapping pulses of energy in the moss, and afternoons learning to interpret Nirth's patterns. It did not need voice to speak. Its gestures were grids of color that her skin could read, an idea of hunger, a suggestion of caution, a joke that looked like a filament winking at a node. It taught her by touch, allowing her to place her hand on a living tapestry and feel a history like a soft pressure. In return, she offered sequences of light she had developed with her tablet, blinking patterns that approximated human counting. It was slow intimacy, not physical in the way lonely humans expected, but intimate enough that when Nirth pressed its flower into her palm, Salana understood it as a favor, a trust that could not be returned lightly. Jack watched from edges and doorways. He offered technical suggestions. At first they were professional, the kind of corrections a former partner offered because he still knew her methods. But as days blurred into months, his presence coalesced into a different gravity. He would stand near the cave mouth under a sky the color of lentils and watch Salana and Nirth trade glows. When she walked back to camp at dusk, still smelling faintly of pollen and cavestone, his voice would take on a guard's tautness, and his hands would rest on her shoulders longer than necessary. She felt his possessiveness like pressure behind the sternum, like an old bruise. Small things shifted in the pattern of the mission. Supplies were delayed, not by storms but by misdirected logs. The transmission feed from the surface would inexplicably catch static at the exact moment Salana had discovered another bloom forming in Nirth's absence. Jack learned the ways of the cave, where a wall hummed with a low sympathetic chord, where the fungus bled light if pricked. He began to measure not just rocks and flora, but distances between them and Salana, the number of steps she took into the cavern, the time she lingered, the way she laughed without thinking when Nirth pressed a filament against her palm. His jealousy did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like frost. At first it showed an impatience, a snip at a question, a suggestion recorded with a clipped tone. Then his hands started slipping into actions dressed as necessity. He insisted on recalibrating sensors that had hummed true for weeks. He argued about the protocol of contact, about the rules they had set for preserving the aliens' autonomy. He spoke about precedent and the ethical frameworks that had steadied them. He used those frameworks like a shield so no one would ask what his real motive was. Salana noticed, and the notice made her uneasy. She tried to invite him into the slow, luminous conversations.
She taught him one of the patterns, a simple cadence that suggested friend. Jack took it, repeated it, but the way he used it without giving it back felt like borrowing a word and wearing it the wrong way. He grew quieter in the mornings. He started returning to the data logs alone, tracing the moments when Nurth's interactions seemed most open. He would say, to anyone listening, that his concern was for safety, for preserving the fragile bridge between species. He was careful to keep his hands clean of anything that would be considered misconduct. That was the most dangerous part. His planning learned to look like diligence. There was a night, late, when Salana woke to a tremor, not from geology, but from the expedition's comms reporting a drop in the cave's energy. Nurth's signature should have been steady. She grabbed a light and ran toward the mapped corridor, voice hoarse in the dark. Jack was there, leaning against the sensor bank, pale under the pitiless LED. His eyes were bright with secrets. He did not explain why he had rerouted a containment field. He said only, half apologetic and half certain, that the readings had been inconsistent and that he had to act to stabilize contact. He had acted. He had introduced a protein-binding agent the mission carried for invasive flora, the kind of biochemical designed to neutralize an aggressive organism before it altered a habitat. He told himself it would force Nurth to withdraw from the vulnerable tissues and let human science study it safely. He told himself he would not hurt anyone. He told himself this was to protect Salana from the unknown. He didn't imagine a creature that spoke in filament and light would interpret forced intervention as violation. He did not foresee the way Nurth would respond to a stranger injecting a foreign protocol into the very language of its world. When the agent spread, it did not look like a toxin. It looked like frost over a window, a soft crystalline bloom that traveled along the veins of the moss and reached toward the living nodes. Where it touched, nervous-like tissue grew stiff. Nurth recoiled. The cave's hum twisted into a higher pitch. Salana arrived with the medic suit open and the taste of ozone in her mouth. Nurth was at the center of the chamber, a figure of wan light and trembling filaments, and the blossom it had once offered lay dark in the soil. Nurth's movements were jagged, her usual rhythm interrupted by a shudder. Jack stepped forward, hands up in an automatic admission of guilt, then turned the admission into an argument about necessity. "We had to," he began. "Why?" Salana's question was not directed at the protocols. It was directed at the man she had once loved, at the same fingers that had once traced constellations in the gel light above a table. His answer fractured like a cheap pain. "He was changing," Jack said finally, meaning Nurth, but the word looked like and sounded like something else. "You were changing." "You were not mine anymore." There was a heat in his voice that made the cave feel narrower. Nurth's filaments reflexed toward Salana, offering less a petal than a shield. The alien's glow deepened into a pattern Salana had never seen, a lattice of light that tasted to her like apology and sorrow. It understood what had been done. It felt the foreign agent, and it understood the man who had introduced it. Jack's plan had always been half hope, half absence of thinking. He thought he could stop the unfamiliar by pressing a protocol against it. He thought that would restore order, bring Salana back into an orbit that included him. He had not imagined the fallout would be a human body caught in the middle of an ecosystem trying to heal itself. The agent had cross-reacted with the biofilm that processed Veera's specific chemistry. A shockwave of binding energy had leapt unexpectedly. Salana had stepped forward to pull Nurth away from the central node and felt the cold, plant-tasting edge nick her arm. It wasn't lethal at once, but it coiled into nerves and burned with a slow ferocity. Her legs did not fail, but time narrowed. She saw the medic kit in Jack's hand like a small assurance of error. She saw his face and for an impossible second believed the man who said his actions were a mistake. Her breath came quick, but not because of pain. The weight of betrayal sat on her sternum like a stone. Her chest tightened with a fracture that was older than the cave. Old love, old trust, old misbelief.
When blood pooled at her sleeve, it looked obscene next to the soft, living lights. She did not want to die in that cave. She did not want Nurth to see it. She knew the alien's sense of continuity would be violated by human death within its coral heart. She looked at Nurth. The alien's gaze, if it could be called that, smoothed into a pattern that suggested comprehension and an ethic. Nurth had options that did not correlate with human law. It understood balance in ways they had only begun to learn. Salana felt, with the clarity of someone who has read too much and loved too little, that there were fewer options for pain than her science could account for. "I beg you, just make it quick," she said, not to Jack, though his name haunted the shape of the words, but to Nurth. She did not believe it would answer in the terms of human mercy. She formed the phrase as a key, one that might unlock something other than death. Her throat tightened as the plea slid across the stone like a bird. Nurth stilled. The freeze was not metaphorical. The air became a single suspended instrument. The cave's hum faltered and then folded into silence as complete as a paused film. Bioluminescent veins arrested mid-wave. Even Jack's breath caught and hung in the space between rib and shirt like mist. Salana felt the weight of the stoppage in a new way. The world had taken a breath and was holding it. In that held moment, something old and alien and unaskable made its decision.
The unthinkable act Nurth performed was not born from caprice. It bent towards Salana, and Salana knew with the sick, astonishing clarity of the imminent, offered itself. Not a violent severance, but an ethical transposition. Nurth's filaments, which had been separate appendages of light and matter, began to unfold into a lattice that drew together the chemical signatures of the cave with the electrical patterns of Salana's consciousness. There was a sensation like being wrapped in sun-warm moss, and a cold like distant ice. Pain did not vanish so much as transmogrify. Her body's pain loosened as focus slid, not out of existence, but into something wider. She felt her memories like leaves, scattering and aligning in the cave's pattern. Nurth transferred something that was not merely life, but a method of living within Veera's processes. Jack reached forward, perhaps to stop it, perhaps to amend it, but his hands encountered the freeze. Motion refused him. The alien's lattice curled around Salana's chest and then threaded through her thoughts, not to erase but to rehouse them, aligning thought with pulse, aligning grief with hum, aligning human sense with planetary sense. It was an act of compassion and rejection at once. Compassion because Nurth answered her plea to, as she had asked, make it quick. Rejection because it refused the human assumption that quickness meant obliteration. Nurth could not bear to watch Salana die among the filaments, any more than it could bear to let her suffer. It chose to preserve her in a different register, to convert a mortal chemistry into a longer, other kind of existence. From human vantage, the cost looked like the end of Salana's body. From Veera's vantage, it looked like integration. The cave light flared, then dimmed into a new tone. Salana felt no pain now, only a profound unmooring, and a sudden, startling sense of belonging to the stone. She tasted the cave's slow blood, and with it memories of places she had never been, an elder tree's slow counting of years, the patient shifts of crust and fungus across the planet's ages. Her voice, when it came, was not the same. It threaded with harmonics she had learned from Nurth, carrying images like small luminous beads. Jack's face was a face that made no sense, because the man who had hoped to hold her had set in motion the thing that unmade his claim. He fell to his knees, silent, hands empty of any reclamation. The medic's kit lay where it had been tossed. It was irrelevant now. He had wanted to seize control and had instead triggered a transfiguration. People later would call Nurth's act sacrificial. Those who argued with anger would call it monstrous. There were, in truth, many names for the moment. The thing Nurth did was not murder or mercy in any way the human lexicon handled cleanly. It was a radical ethical move by a being that experienced life as continuity rather than a series of discrete possessible things.
To Nurth, binding Salana's consciousness to the cave was a way of mending a wound it could not otherwise heal. When motion returned, it did so slowly and with a new music. The hum resumed, but it was layered now with a higher chord, a human frequency braided into planetary tones. The bioluminescent veins carried a different rhythm. Nurth itself had in places thinned, its filamentous body showing seams where it had given of itself. Its blow was less robust, as if something vital had been poured elsewhere. It remained, but smaller, quieter. It had the exhausted contentment of a creature that had altered its own shape to honor a different justice. Jack put his face in his hands and made sounds that were not words. Salana watched him from inside an expanded presence. She felt the edges of herself dissolve into moss and rock and pulse. Her first sensation on the other side of embodiment was not sorrow, but astonishment. She understood, with a clarity that felt like sunlight through glass, that Nirth's sympathy had been absolute. It could not reconcile human betrayal by mimicking human norms. So instead, it braided her into the cave. The aftermath stretched into long days of dull, bureaucratic grief. The expedition wrote reports about contamination and protocol violation, and the unforeseen chemical reaction. They debated what constituted harm, and whether Jack's action had been malicious or a catastrophic misjudgment born of love twisted into fear. Salana's colleagues were devastated and angry. They shouted in corridors and rewrote ethics guidelines. Some wanted to keep the secret. A human mind integrated with Veera's patterns would be a miracle to exploit. Others wanted to sanctify it, to accept the event as an act of interspecies grace. Jack stayed. He stayed because leaving would be an escape. Staying meant that he had to face the living fact of what he had done, that his hands had broken something, and Nirth had paid for it in a way he could not fix. He became small in the presence of the caves. The light around him seemed to avoid filling the hollows he carried. He tried to speak to Salana the way he had before, and found that words were inadequate. Sometimes he thought he heard a distant pattern echoing through the cave in a cadence that felt like a memory, and that stung like a reproach. Nirth recovered slowly, if it recovered at all. Its filaments grew less dense where it had given. The flowers it tended showed a pallor, then a resilience.
They debated whether Jack was a villain or a broken man who had failed at loving someone properly. Salana's name became a fulcrum for those questions. What is it to keep someone? What do we owe to those who are not like us? How do you apologize when the harm you caused applies to things not contained within legal frameworks, when the hurt extends into a web of living systems? Salana, if that name still fit the thing that hummed through the cave walls, learned how to trace grief into the long patience of Veera. She could no longer pick up a spoon or sign a report, but she could press a filament and feel an echo of Jack move through it. She could fold a memory like a petal and lay it against a fungus to see it bloom as a new thought. Her existence was different, not lesser. To the human eye, the body that had once been hers lay still beneath the cave and could be studied as a casualty or relic. To the cave, she was a new node, a human sensibility braided into planetary continuity. The ethics of that remained complicated, but the living fact was stubborn. Jack learned to ask for forgiveness in ways that could not be fully answered. He simulated quiet gifts, wrote apologies into the margins of datalogs, tended to the algae pools as if that maintenance could balance the ledger. He was punished by the very thing he had hoped to possess. He could no longer shape Salana's life to suit his comfort. He had to watch instead, learn to read the glows, and accept that the being he loved had been shifted into a mode he could not command. Months later, when a quiet reporter visited the camp and asked if Salana had ceased to be human, Nirth answered with a filament that pressed like a hand against the reporter's palm. The pattern formed, slow, patient, luminous, and within it was both apology and explanation. The alien did not concede that what it did was right in a human sense. It insisted instead on its own logic. When life brackets a violent act, when suffering proliferates, sometimes the most ethical response is to redistribute pain into a form that preserves continuity. It had done what it considered least wrong. There was no tidy resolution,
There were no courtroom judgments that made everything feel clean. Jack's name survived as a cautionary tale for the arrogance of possession. Salana's new presence became a study and a poem, depending on who described it. Nirth kept tending the caves, carrying in its diminished glow the knowledge that, to protect the living web, sometimes demanded decisions human hearts would not comfortably make. When the wind slid through the cave and a luminescence rippled, people from houses on other planets would say they could hear laughter threaded into the vibration, like the memory of a person who had once loved light so much she had given herself to it.
Sometimes, if you stood at the mouth and pressed your palm against the wall, you would feel a quick pulse that answered with a cadence that sounded a lot like the pattern Salana had taught Nirth to blink. And Jack, he learned, as humans must sometimes, that the cost of trying to possess another life can be the life of what you love. He planted a bed of phosphorescent moss near the entrance, tending it in the soft, contrite way people tend to small things when they can no longer fix the large ones. He came to understand the planet's ethics as a slow, unavoidable mirror. The final question was not whether Nirth had been cruel or merciful. It was whether timid human hearts could learn from a being that measured life in continuities rather than property. In the undercurrent of that lesson, the expedition's logs carried one clear admonition: wonder is not an invitation to take. Curiosity must come with humility. And when you harm what you cannot own, there are ways the world responds that will insist, with a firmness that is not human, on setting the balance back. At the mouth of the cave, where light met air and the planet sighed like an ancient thing remembering a name, people paused to listen. The glow there was steady and new. If you stayed long enough and let the hum fill your bones, you could almost hear Salana's voice braided into the pulse, a pattern of light answering questions and asking others. It did not speak revenge. It did not demand justice. It simply existed in the way a river exists, patient, carrying the things that fell into it downstream, changing them into new life. If you left Veera a wiser person, it was because you had been forced to reckon with the cost of wanting to own wonder. And if you were human, and you had loved and erred like Jack, you learned that apology would not be a bridge back to what you had taken. It would be the start of a very different work, tending, rebuilding, learning to listen without claiming. The last image that remained in many minds, more than any tribunal, more than any textbook, was of Nirth as it had been after that night, diminished, luminous, keeping an eye on a cave that sang now with two lives folded into one. It was not the ending anyone had hoped for. It was an ending that felt in the bones of the planet, like a consequence wrought by an ethic older than ownership. Some called it mercy, others called it loss. All of them learned in their own ways to measure curiosity not by what you can take, but by what you can leave intact. If you watched the sky above Veera at the right hour, you could see the light of the cave wash through the atmosphere like a slow pulse. In that light, the story did not end with neat answers. It ended with the amber certainty that wonder asks for restraint. It ended with Salana, no longer purely human, no longer entirely distant, reaching out to the living world and teaching it, in small filaments of luminous rhythm, how to be together without claiming possession. If this story reached you and tightened something in your chest, stay curious. Subscribe for more stories that ask what we owe to the things we don't yet understand.